Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a presentation that we have been giving to people throughout the city of Omaha to help them understand the new Omaha streetcar that we will be building in the urban core. And so I hope you learn from this presentation. And if you have any questions, be sure you go to omahastreetcar.org and pose the question there, and someone would be happy to answer your question. So I'd like to start by just explaining that in early 2022, the Greater Omaha Chamber of Commerce released its Urban Core Strategic Plan. The purpose of that plan was to identify some of the challenges facing the city of Omaha and its urban core, and also to provide some strategies to build on the momentum of the many positive things that were happening in the core. So the plan said, cities never stand still. They're either growing and moving forward, or they are declining and falling behind. And as I said, there are a lot of great things that are happening in our urban core. It's becoming a place that's really something special, a vibrant, accessible community that attracts new businesses and young professionals. And the modern streetcar is a piece of the puzzle that signals we are on track to building a dynamic city for our next generation. But we are facing some issues, as I said. And so the plan identifies that the city of Omaha is beginning to run out of room at its suburban edge. And probably in about 30 years, or by the time the city of Omaha reaches its 200th birthday, Omaha will become more or less landlocked and be stuck with a fixed and hopefully not, but perhaps declining tax base, while at the same time facing increased costs for maintaining aging infrastructure. Another issue facing the city in the urban core is that from 1963 until about 2014, Omaha lost 21,000 jobs in the urban core. Now, at the same time, we added about 12,000 parking stalls, but in many ways, we've been trading jobs for parking in the urban core. To help you understand what that looks like and what that means physically, this is a map looking at downtown and midtown in 1963. And the highlighted areas are the off-street parking areas, the 29,000 roughly parking stalls that were off-street in the urban core in 1963. In 2014, we had significantly increased the amount of land devoted to parking. And when you take out the right-of-way and the I-480 overpass system and North Freeway and so forth, we are reaching a point where about 50% of this urban core area is devoted to parking. But only about 50% of that parking is being used at any given point in time. So a lot of that existing parking is vacant. When we looked at the market studies for the future development in the urban core, and we've been doing market studies since 2009, the market studies all tell us about the same thing, and that is that we should be able to attract about 30,000 jobs and 30,000 residents over the next 30 years. But the problem with that is that if we were to continue to attract those jobs and residents the way we have in the past, we would need to build about 50,000 new parking stalls. And those stalls would cost about $1.5 billion to build. Now, presently, we are able to balance out the subsidies that we provide to a lot of the off-street parking for various companies and users in the urban core by being able to more efficiently use our parking that we have today. The problem is that when you add another 50,000 parking stalls on top of the current number of stalls that we have, we will no longer be able to achieve that balance, and we will need to begin to subsidize that new additional parking with public tax dollars. Another problem is that those 50,000 parking stalls would consume about 40 square blocks of our urban core with nothing but 6-story tall garages that pay essentially nothing in property taxes. At the same time, when we develop in the urban core, it's not unusual for us to average about $50 million worth of development on each block. So losing 40 square blocks to parking means that we lose the opportunity for about $2 billion in additional new development that would pay taxes to the city and the other taxing entities. Now, maybe this is something that every city faces, and so we've looked at a lot of cities around the country, and Denver is one that we have really focused on. Denver in 1976 did pretty much what Omaha has done, built a lot of off-street parking in an effort to compete with suburban development. And so this is an aerial of part of Denver in 1976, downtown Denver. This is that same area today. Now, downtown Denver has about the same number of parking stalls that we have here in Omaha in the urban core, but they have about 4.5 times as many jobs in their urban core as we have here in Omaha. And so they're doing something different. And what they're doing is they're using a permanent rail transit system along with an improved transit system to really generate more development in their urban core. And so when we've looked at what they've done, we think that we can achieve the same thing. A streetcar in our urban core will help us lessen the need for more parking because it allows people to move around without a car. So the streetcar allows us to better utilize the thousands of existing vacant parking stalls, that 50% vacant stalls that I mentioned before. It reduces the number of new stalls needed for new projects. It frees up all of those blocks that would otherwise be devoted to parking for billions of dollars of new development, and actually generates so much additional new revenue that we could use that revenue to help facilitate the development of affordable housing. Now, just recently, we've met with developers who are planning new projects in the urban core, and they're telling us that this is happening for them. They're actually reducing the number of stalls in their new projects because they know that the permanency of the streetcar means that they will have access to other parking beyond what they can provide on their site. So they can build more units and build less parking. As I said, we looked at a lot of cities around the country. We've done over 20 separate site visits over the last 20 years, visiting various cities in the country to see what works and what doesn't work. And today there are over 46 cities in the country that either already have streetcars or that are in the process of planning and building streetcars. And what we've found across the country is that just as in the Denver example, as the density of the urban core increases, which is critical for us to be able to house those 30,000 new residents and contain those 30,000 jobs, that as density increases, transit, it becomes very critical. And in particular, cities move toward rail transit, permanent transit. So many cities that are even less dense than Omaha have already moved towards rail transit. So we're not unusual when we look at cities across the country. So streetcars drive growth. As I said, they connect people with major districts, destinations, and activity centers in the urban core. They revitalize our urban core by encouraging economic development and optimizing our tax base. They provide simple, localized, high-frequency transit service. Every 10 minutes, a streetcar will come to the stop that you're at. So you don't need a schedule to know when the next one is coming. It also provides an opportunity for a variety of new housing types because we can cover a larger area. And it also helps to attract and retain young talent. We recently made a presentation, the mayor and I, to the YP Summit. We had a packed house of probably around 300 young adults to hear what we had to say about the streetcar. And they were very excited about the potential. In a more personal note, I have a granddaughter who recently moved to the urban core, moved downtown. She really enjoys downtown, but she will be graduating from UNO here in a few months. And when that happens, she's looking for jobs around the country. She said to me the other night when we were at dinner, you know, Grandpa, I really hope that that I can find something here in Omaha because I think the urban core is so great and I can hardly wait to ride the streetcar. So I know that it has an impact on how young people see our city and our urban core. So to give you an idea of what it might look like, This is an image that comes from the Urban Core Strategic Plan. On the left side of this image, the brown building is the Rose Theater. So you're looking west on Farnham Street from just a little bit west of 20th. Now, if you're familiar with this area, right now there are a lot of vacant parking lots in this area. We rode through this area recently with the owner of those lots, a developer who has built a lot of apartments in the urban core. He said that he has held on to these lots specifically because of the streetcar. He said if we did not build the streetcar, he would eventually build housing on these lots, probably for 3 to 4 story buildings with a lot of adjacent parking. But he said because of the streetcar, he can build less parking and go much more dense. And so he's talking about buildings of this scale that you see in the drawing, 8 to 10 stories, because he does not need as much parking. He can lease those units for more, and he can take advantage of that opportunity for increased density. So it's important to understand that the streetcar is really an infrastructure investment, not unlike investing in streets and sewers and other basic infrastructure. It's also something that then generates economic development, much like what we have done at Exarban Village, or what a developer does in a suburban SID. So to give you an idea of how this works, in the case of Exarban Village, the city paid to install the initial streets and sewers and utilities, that initial infrastructure that made it possible for Exarban Village development to occur. And then as that development occurred, the additional taxes that were paid, that tax increment, a portion of that tax increment came back to the city to reimburse the city for the initial infrastructure. In the case of SIDs in the suburban fringe, an SID is a sanitary and improvement district. And so developers in the suburban areas are able to issue tax-free municipal bonds, much like a city, that they use to install that initial infrastructure. Again, the streets, sewers, parks, and other initial public infrastructure. Then as development occurs and taxes are paid, a portion of those taxes come back to the developer to pay off those municipal bonds. These are projects that are done by the city and developers all the time, and they are projects that do not require a public vote. So how do you pay for a streetcar? You build a streetcar. The streetcar increases economic development. It increases property values and tax revenue. And we can take a portion of that tax revenue then to pay for the streetcar construction. So how does that work? Well, this is an example of how TIF works and then how it would be changed with a streetcar. So taking one of those vacant parking lots that we talked about in the urban core, they have a very low value on that property. So they pay a little bit in taxes. Over time, the property goes up a little bit a year in value. And so, yes, the taxes do increase on that property over time, but very slowly and very small amount. Now, if a developer were to take one of those vacant parking lots, the developer, much like what I mentioned a minute ago, that new development would have a significantly higher value. So maybe on that parking lot that might be valued at $500,000, the developer builds a new project that adds $20 million in additional new value on the property, and then they pay taxes on that additional new $20 million. Now, the taxing entities continue to get the tax revenue that they were already getting from that parking lot. But the increased tax revenue that is paid by the developer, in this case, comes back to the developer to pay for some of their expenses and some of the public improvements needed for their development. At the end of 15 years, when they have been paid back from that tax increment, that entire increase in tax revenue now goes on to the city, county, school district, and other taxing entities. So what happens with the streetcar? What we have found in studies that have been conducted across the country, including federal studies, is that the streetcar bumps the value of development again above what it would otherwise be. Now, across the country, that range of increase is anywhere from about 7% to 28%. And so the streetcar actually increases the value of that development, and therefore that developer pays additional taxes because of the increased value in their property created by the streetcar. It is the revenue from that light green area that we show for the streetcar. That is the revenue that we would then use to pay for the construction of the streetcar. And again, once the streetcar bonds are paid off, just as the developer's debt is paid off, all of that increased tax revenue flows to the city, county, school district, and other taxing entities. And so as you see, there is eventually a point at which the increase in tax revenue far exceeds what would otherwise happen with the increase in value on that parking lot. So what's really critical to understand in what we are doing with the streetcar is what we are using the TIF for. So what we are doing in the corridor, in a 6 to 7 block corridor on either side of the streetcar line, is we are going to be taking revenue from that increased value of new development. But we are only taking the revenue from the taxes paid by new or redeveloped income producing commercial and multifamily properties. We are not taking revenue from any increases in value that would come from single family homes, condominiums, or residential buildings with 4 or fewer units. So the project will cost about $306 million under our current estimates. And we are projecting in the urban core that we will see about $3.2 billion in new development over the next 15 years. Now, we want to be very conservative in our estimates of how much new development would occur. And so that $3.2 billion is actually less than what we have seen in terms of development over the last 15 years. It is also far less than what we believe will happen as a result of the streetcar. And so we're being very conservative when we talk about $3.2 billion worth of development over the next 15 years. What's also important to understand is that with Mutual of Omaha's commitment to build their new tower in downtown, and the fact that they will redevelop their current campus, what will happen is the new tower is about $600 million, and the redevelopment of their current campus will probably be somewhere around $400 million. So we are beginning this process with basically $1 billion worth of new development already committed to that urban core area where we will be collecting the revenue to pay for the streetcar. We also already have somewhere around $125 million worth of projects that are either already approved or in the pipeline for approval in the urban core. And we are still in the process of just beginning our analysis of what it's going to cost and our plan for constructing the streetcar. So we are doing very well to, again, be very conservative and to make sure that we can generate the revenue needed to pay for the streetcar. The city hired a company named MuniCap. And MuniCap is kind of the gold standard across the country, used by companies who are going to float bonds, and they want to ensure their investors that there would be sufficient revenue to pay for those bonds. And so because the city will be issuing bonds that will have no recourse back on the city, it's important that we can assure investors that the revenue will be there to pay off those bonds. Now, MuniCap took all of the information that we gave them that showed that $3.2 billion worth of development. They looked at every single parcel of land within that 6 to 7 block corridor on either side of the line. And they spent about 9 months reviewing all of the information and determining the minimum amount of development that they felt they could guarantee would happen. After 9 months, they came back and said that they would project that there would be about $608 million in tax increment revenue that would come in as a result of development over the next 15 years. That is more than enough revenue to cover the bonds for the $306 million in construction. Now, as I said, they were conservative. They actually said they can guarantee that there would be $2 billion worth of development over that 15-year period. And because we know that there will be at least $3.2 billion in development, we know that there will be additional tax increment revenue over the next 15 years that will come to the city. probably together with the 608 million, we'll see over $1 billion in TIF revenue over the next 15 years. As I mentioned earlier, that additional $400 million can then be used to help pay for affordable housing and other mobility infrastructure like bikeways and streetcar extensions in the urban core. So again, the streetcar pays for itself. There's no citywide property tax rate increase needed, no money diverted from other city projects, so there will not be money taken away from filling potholes or street repairs, no money used from property outside of the streetcar corridor, no money, as I said earlier, used from single-family homes, condos, residential buildings with 4 or fewer units. The only revenue that we are using to pay for the bonds to build the streetcar is revenue from new or redeveloped income-producing commercial and multifamily properties within that 6 to 7 block corridor. Only the people who benefit from the streetcar will pay for the streetcar. Now, the route that many of you have already seen is now on the screen. And starting at UNMC on the west, about 42nd Street, the streetcar will travel east on Farnham to Turner Boulevard, where it will switch over to Harney Street. It will head east on Harney to 10th Street. At 10th, it will go north to the front door of the CHI Health Center, then back south on 10th Street to Capitol Avenue, east to 8th Street, south to Farnham, and then Farnham back west to UNMC. We are well into the preliminary design effort. We are past 15% design. We are close to a 30% design. The Streetcar Authority has approved the hiring of Kiewit Construction to do pre-construction services. So Kiewit will work with HDR, who is the designer of the project, to look at the design. When they reach 30% design, they will cost out that design. They will look for ways to save money and look for ways that we can redesign and perhaps plan the eventual construction of the project to keep our costs as low as possible. And so that work will be going on this year. We'll reach final design later this year, probably in the fall. We are also in the process of preparing the RFP that will go out for potential companies to construct the vehicles that we will use. We'll have 6 vehicles that will run the route. We will put that out for bid later this year. It takes several years to get those vehicles, so it's important that we order those in 2023. We may begin some utility relocation work in late 2023, but the bulk of the construction will take place in 2024, 25, and early 26. The vehicles will come in 2026. We will go through several months of testing on all of the vehicles, as well as making sure that the track alignment and the other systems work properly. And we'll be able to open for service in probably December of 2026. So back to the Urban Core Strategic Plan. Keeping that plan as our guide, it says to reach our potential, Omaha must reaffirm and reinforce the urban core's historic role as a cultural, entertainment, residential, and employment part of the region. The streetcar gets us there. Well, thank you for listening. And as I said, if you have questions, go to omahastreetcar.org and submit your questions there, and someone will be happy to answer your questions. So I hope this has been informative, and thank you for listening.